How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
So here at Culture Architects podcast, I love having conversations with people who come at the culture conversation from a variety of different viewpoints or disciplines. So today I have a really interesting guest with me, Stephan Wiedner. And Stephan is a psychological safety expert, which is really interesting. We're going to get into this. He's also the CEO of Noomii and also Zarango. In 2007, Stephan co-founded Noomii, which is an extensive network of professional coaches that's based in Vancouver. And then in 2021, he went on to found Zarango, which is a training program for nurturing psychologically safe workplaces. Today, both companies are global leaders in corporate coaching, and it's all founded on this whole idea that we're going to go into today of psychological safety. So I'm really looking forward to uncovering with you a lot more about how this intersects with the whole conversation around culture. So Stephan, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
David, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
That's great. So this whole idea of psychological safety, culture is hot. Everyone knows, everybody's talking about culture. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about psychological safety. I hear a lot of, DEI and other things, but not a lot about psychological safety, though I know they're obviously related. So bring me back to, how did you even get into this whole topic? Before we get into it and talk more about what is it and why is it important, what do you do about it, how did you come across this concept?
Yeah, well, you touched on my background in coaching. So we've delivered one-on-one coaching to many different organizations, many different leaders, and we've been doing that for years. Mm-hmm. And as anybody working in the L&D space, I think there's an appreciation for wanting to demonstrate measurable outcomes, mm-hmm. right? And being able to say, hey, here's the ROI for the work that we just did. So you spent a bunch of money and you got an ROI for that, and you need to be able to demonstrate that to increase budgets and have more money flowing towards training and development and coaching and so on and so forth. So my interest initially for psychological safety was as a means for measuring the impact of coaching. So whenever we have had coaching engagements with executive leaders, C-suite leaders or VPs, et cetera, what I found is that for every single one of those leaders, if it wasn't expressly communicated, what they really wanted to do was be able to build psychological safety. Like they wanted to be better leaders. They wanted to foster their team. They wanted to improve their delegation skills, et cetera, et cetera. So these were all the things they were working on. And if I could broadly summarize all of them, they all really were trying to foster psychological safety in their team. And when I read about it and learned about it, what occurred to me right away was, this is something we can measure. We can measure this before the engagement, and we can measure it after the engagement. And it seemed to make a lot of sense to me, because if you have a leader and you're trying to improve their interpersonal skills or their leadership skills, who better to ask than their team? Mm-hmm. And you can ask the team, say, how is this member doing? How is this individual or leader doing with respect to their leadership skills? Or you can ask them a little more of an indirect question, which is, to what degree are you feeling psychologically safe in this work environment? And our belief is that those two things are sort of mutually, they're more or less the same thing. And it seems like a more objective measure than, assess me on my skills. Right. Instead of assessing a leader on their skills, you're just assessing your own sense of psychological safety in your team environment, in your work environment.
So we're going to come back, and I want to go deeper on defining, what do we mean by psychological safety, and what are some of the ways that you measure that? But let me just say broadly, my experience is, and I'm sure it mirrors yours, that when I look at all the work we've done with working on culture and working with so many different organizations and leadership, certainly one of the things that I see is that if I were to distill most of the issues and challenges that I hear leaders talk about, I would broadly call them communication. Now, psychological safety is going to be a big part of that, but we don't communicate well enough around here. We don't communicate effectively. It's all communication. And so many issues that people say are about process, it's not really process, it's just communication. If we communicated better, we'd solve that problem in an instant. So clearly communication is the cornerstone of it all. And what I hear you saying is a foundation of effective communication is creating an environment of psychological safety. Would that be an accurate way of describing that?
Yes, I think that's well said. And there's communication skills, and I would maybe use the term interpersonal skills, which are,
okay.
I mean, gosh, are they really that different? They're more or less the same thing.
Right, right.
Right, because I would say communication skills could include things like email, and whereas interpersonal, well, that's not true, because an email communication is
sure
interpersonal anyway.
Right. Yes. So let's go deeper than that then. So if creating an environment of, as you're calling it, psychological safety is critical to success, how would you define that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll offer two definitions. The first is by Amy Edmondson. So she's a Harvard prof. She's a researcher. She's really popularizing the term and leading the research. She's been researching the topic for well over 20 years, 25 years even. And her definition is that psychological safety is a belief that within your work environment, you can speak up, you can say what's on your mind, you can even admit mistakes, and you can do all of that without some form of reprimand. So there's no fear of reprimand, some sort of social consequence. And, an obvious consequence is, gosh, if I say something, I'm going to get fired.
Right.
Which does happen, but I think a much more subtle impact is ever present in just about every conversation is, if I say something, will I come across as maybe confrontational? Maybe I'm going to come across as stupid or not smart enough or not professional enough. So these are the little, the little voices in our head all the time that are influencing what we say and when we say it. And then the other definition that I'd like to offer is one that we deliver in our training, which is perhaps a little bit more action oriented. And we say it's the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that you'll be heard. So those two halves are really important. And we came up with this definition right about at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a lot of protesting going on. And what we concluded there is, that's so interesting, because these folks have the courage to speak up. And so that was synonymous with our definition of psychological safety, this desire to speak up, right? And the courage to speak up is not enough, because protesters are speaking up because they don't feel like what they have to say is being heard.
Right.
And so notice how those two halves are really required. You really need to have people feel like when they do have something to offer and share, it will be understood, it will be appreciated. It doesn't mean that it will be agreed with. So we're not talking about agreement. We're just talking about, creating a space for oppositional points of view, for unique points of view that might not be in alignment with the prevailing point of view in the room.
So what's interesting about that, as I think about that, is we talk with all of our clients. There are certain communication skills we teach in every one of our clients. One of them we call listen generously, which is teaching people the skills to create that safe space, to be a good listener. There's another one that we call speak straight, which is about, on the other side of that, as you're saying, the flip side of that is having the courage and the skills, because I may have the courage to have honest conversations, but if I don't know how to do it very effectively, it may fall flat. It may not hit with the intended goals that I have. So teaching people both sides of that. There's another behavior that we teach often. We call it practice blameless problem solving, which goes back to creating a safe environment. If we have an environment in which we're not doing a lot of blame, but we're practicing blameless problem solving, we're creating a safe space where it's okay to try things, to experiment, etc. And so all of those are interrelated, are interrelated parts of that. One of the things I find interesting, though, is that when we talk about having the courage to have those, to provide feedback, to have that honest conversation, one of the things I sometimes talk about, and I'm curious about your point of view about this, is that I say in a really effective organization, not only is it safe to have that honest conversation? And are you encouraged to have that honest conversation, but you're expected to have that conversation? In other words, it's not okay to hold back and reserve, your point of view. Tell me more about your point of view about that.
I love that. That's fantastic. Because it shifts the onus of responsibility a little bit, right? Yeah. So it's similar to, I remember learning years ago, I studied Buddhism for a while and really got deep into all of the principles that are being taught there. And you talk about creating karma, right? Doing good things and planting good seeds. And if you do bad things, you plant bad seeds, I guess. And so there's this idea of doing good things or an absence of bad things. And so the absence of bad things is, sure, that's good. I'm glad you didn't steal today. Good for you. You didn't murder anyone today. All right. Right. We're looking for not just the absence of bad things, but proactive good things, good actions. Yes. And so I think the way you framed it switches it from the onus of responsibility is on you. If there is something that you need to share, you need to do that. And I think also, we look at radical candor. You're probably familiar with Kim Scott's work. And I think she makes a big point there where she's looking at the two dimensions of her model is to care personally or to challenge directly. And the idea with challenging directly is that it generally should come from a place of care. Right? Because I care about you, because I care about the organization, because I care about the team, I am going to say this, and it's for everyone's betterment. Yeah.
And continuing with that theme of the onus of responsibility, I would say, because I care, because I want to make a difference, I have a responsibility to share this with you. It's not even just, I'm going to, I own the responsibility to speak up. It's not okay for me not to speak up about this. So I'm curious, so how do you teach those skills? I mean, we all can agree that yes, this is important. It's important on both sides of the fence. It's important for me as a leader to create an environment where people feel safe to speak up. And it's important for me to create an environment where I'm teaching people the skills so that they own the responsibility and have the skill set to effectively speak up. How do you teach that?
That's a really good question. Maybe before I answer that question, I want to touch on that environment and what that feels like, because I think often people will think about a psychologically safe environment as, I don't know, we're holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But if you think about that onus of responsibility and taking that on and saying what needs to be said in the moment, that feels different, right? That's a successful work environment. That's one where there's a little more intensity there, right? It's not just we're holding hands and we're friendly. We're what's the word I'm looking for? Like, we're polite. It's not about politeness, right? No. It's about rigor. It's about having those tough conversations, and that doesn't always feel awesome, right? Yeah. It's tough, and that touches on sort of my next point, which is how do you practice these skills? And ultimately, the main concept I would love for your listeners to take away is this idea of deliberate practice. So I think we can all be familiar with the idea of practicing how to play the piano, for example. Even if you haven't practiced to play the piano, you can appreciate that you need to spend time on the keyboard. And you need to spend time learning your chords and learning your scales. And it's just, it's practice. It's repeating over and over again until you get it right. And that's doesn't always feel awesome either, right? Yeah. It's not always fun to practice, but it can absolutely be frustrating, because when you're on the edge of your learning ability, which is one of the principles of deliberate practice, to be on the edge of your abilities, you fail. It's not always easy. You're not hitting the key just right every time. Instead, you're missing it sometimes, and that gets frustrating until you get it. And then, yes, okay, now we can move on to the next thing. So what we have done is we've looked at these interpersonal skills, and we've tried to break them down into much more concrete skills that can be assessed measured, and improved upon.
Okay.
And then we've built an entire technology platform called skillsetter.com. And Skillsetter is this platform for practicing these interpersonal skills. So just the way you would practice music, just the way you would practice as an athlete, learning how to jump further or run faster, we're taking a lot of those principles and applying them to interpersonal skills. So that individuals, and the main premise with the software is that people are exposed to challenging moments within a team.
Okay.
And those clips are generated by actors, and they're maybe a minute long. You're given the context, and then you see the clip, and now you need to record a response using your webcam. And in that moment, your response is using one or maybe two of the skills that you've been trained in, that you're learning, and you practice it over and over again. So just like on the keyboard, you try it once, that wasn't quite right. I'm going to try again. That wasn't quite right. And there's a rubric guiding you. So the rubric will define what the skills look like. So for this skill to be successful, this is generally present, that's present, and you try to avoid judgmentalness, for example, right? And so then you can evaluate yourself. You get to watch yourself, and you get to look at it and go, oh, that was a little bit judgmental. I'm going to try again. And you re-record and you re-record. And then when you're happy with it, you can submit it and get feedback from an expert, someone who's trained to look at these skills and identify them and be able to give constructive feedback to help people get better.
Interesting. So give me an example of what might be a scenario on one of these Skillsetter. Is it called Skillsetter? Is that what you called it?
That's correct.
So give me an example of what might be a scenario and what kind of skill might I be working on?
Yeah, sure. So let's start with a fairly simple one, a skill that we might call reflecting content. So all reflecting content is doing is you're saying back to the individual what they just said without parroting them. You want to paraphrase. And if someone's fairly long-winded, let's say they talk for 5 minutes or 3 minutes, whatever it is, you want to try to make it a little more concise. You want to take the key points and communicate that back to the other individual. Generally, this skill is, we start with that skill because it's fairly easy. People understand it. They appreciate it. And so we'll have a video where the individual is giving a project rundown. Like, oh, this is happening in the project and we're doing this and this and that. And we've had to work overtime and blah, 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 blah. And so then as the individual practicing the skill of reflecting content, you would just say, oh, what I'm understanding is that you've done A, B, and C. Did I get that right? And so you're checking in with the other individual to say, did I get that right? And that's it. And so you would click save and you're done on that particular skill.
Got it. So would you describe, as you think about these skills, so it seems to me as we've started this conversation that there's sort of two halves to this. There's the half of I as a leader need to create an environment in which it is safe for other people, and I need to have people have good skills for speaking up. Does your content divide it in that way, or am I thinking of that maybe in not the most useful way?
I think you're thinking about it in a useful way. Absolutely. We have a number of different training programs that have leveraged the Skillsetter platform, and they're not all focused on psychological safety.
Okay.
So they can be, and we do have a training program that is particularly focused on psychological safety. So when those skills are introduced, we're always introducing them in the context of psychological safety, because I think it's a really it's a very good mental model and construct for people to be keeping in mind as they're communicating and practicing skills. You want to be thinking about not just what am I saying to this individual and how am I saying it, but what's the impact of me speaking to that other person on the rest of the team, on the rest of the individuals that are in that room. I'll give you an example. We have, for example, there's a scenario where someone has been let go and they've been with the organization for many years. They have great alliances with the folks around them, and the manager is not able to divulge any details. All they can say is, I'm sorry, this person's been released from the company. And as you can imagine, there's a variety of emotional reactions to that news. Some are concerned for that individual. Some are concerned for their own jobs. Some are concerned about the workload that now needs to be taken care of because this individual is doing critical work, right? There's all these different concerns, and now you need to say something. And often what we see is managers that are going through this training want to just take it offline. Well, I'll just talk to all of you one-on-one kind of thing, like this desire to handle the stress and the anxiety by managing one-on-one relationships, which feels a lot more comfortable. And yet what we're trying to build is this muscle of courage, right? The courage to have open dialogue on topics that are really tough.
Yeah.
Because it's going to come up. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Interesting. I think one of the things that I think is fascinating about what you said when you were describing earlier that this is hard and that it's not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's about being really rigorous. I was having a conversation recently with, there's a great speaker and a friend of mine named Cujo Teschner, he was an Air Force fighter pilot. And he was a fighter pilot instructor as well. And he's written a book called Debrief to Win, which is a great book. And it's all about, he was the Air Force's subject matter expert on the debrief process. And in the military, in the Air Force in particular, but all aspects of the military, after every mission, there's a very serious debrief. And it's deadly serious. I mean, it's life and death. And they create in that this very rigorous place of psychological safety. So people need to be able to speak up and feel totally confident to do so, and done in a way that nobody's blaming anybody, but there's serious learning and serious accountability about it. And so it's a fascinating study of exactly what you're describing, that it's incredibly rigorous. It is not about singing Kumbaya, but we need to be able to, if it's not safe, if people are worried about speaking up, it's not going to be a very effective debrief, and lives can depend upon it. So it's a very demanding, rigorous process, but it's completely dependent upon psychological safety.
I can't agree more. And I mean, I can relate directly to what you're describing there, because in addition to my profession, I am a volunteer firefighter in my community. I've been so for about 7 or 8 years now. And we don't debrief after every incident because we're all volunteers and we have limited time and everything. And a lot of incidences are very minor, but any incident where there is significant harm or injury or even death to anybody within that scene, we definitely have an after action review that is very serious, and we have protocols around it, and we absolutely need to have psychological safety. And I think once upon a time, certainly within firefighting or maybe policing, there was this bravado, this macho kind of, we're not going to talk about feelings. That is definitely one of the important criteria for this environment, is one where people can also talk about their feelings, like the impact, the emotional impact that an event has had on them. And I think that's also a really healthy aspect. Now, of course, not every work environment will focus on that, because what it is that people are encountering is perhaps not as emotionally laden, but there's always going to be emotions, especially when there's a challenge, right? And that's been a big part of our focus. It's easy to be a manager. It's easy to be a leader when everybody gets along, things are good, we're hitting targets. It's when we're not, that's when it gets a lot more challenging and tough.
And that concludes the first part of my conversation with Stephan Wiedner, psychological safety expert and co-founder and CEO of both Noomii and Zarango. In the next episode, Stephan and I continue finding the connections between psychological safety and culture building. And we'll hear about 2 very important things to keep in mind and to practice if you want to cultivate a psychologically safe workplace.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.